Episode 1. This episode focuses on work. We hope you enjoy listening. Introduction. What is work? Is there a difference between your work and your job? I once asked a young man what he did for a living. I compose Christian music, but unfortunately, recording studios do not accept my music, was his rather dispirited response. What do you do for money? I asked. I wash cars at motor parks, he replied in a matter-of-fact tone, almost as if the washing of cars was just a means to an end. In this scenario, which is his work, what he would like to do or what he had to do? Is a job work which provides money, while unpaid efforts are set aside as matters of interest and hobbies? During the course of my research into retirement, Dr. Peter Abu, a consultant and senior lecturer in industrial education, at the University of Ibadan, in Nigeria, prompted me in the vast arena of work. He asked me, why do people work? I like to put that question differently. What do we want from work? Material reward, identity, fame, friendship, status? If people do not work, how will they get money to buy commodities? How will they measure wealth, or success, or happiness? Has work always been the way to the good life and happiness that many people would like to have? If you have enough money for all your needs, would you still work? If you take away work, do you necessarily take away the means of access to many of the pleasures and opportunities of modern society? If people do not work, what will they retire from? Will they have an old age to look up to? What structures will they put in place to give pattern to their existence? Would a world without work provoke a debate on the whole point and purpose of life? Employment which provides work is in short supply. There is erosion of the employment culture. For several decades past, new patterns of work have been emerging and society has been adjusting. There is demand for fewer hours of work, for part-time work, and this will mean shorter working years and longer post-service years. Therefore, there is a rethink needed regarding the whole concept of work. There is a rethink about what we mean by work, why we want, or need to work, and the way work is organized. The changing patterns of work and the erosion of the employment culture will affect our assessment of the meaning of work, our education, our family life, and, ultimately, the kind of life we want to live. About 3 decades ago, Charles Handy asserts in his book The Future of Work, that the individual growing up and leaving school a few years from then had a future to look up to, that would be very different from his or her parents. He would have a different assessment of work. How apt that assertion! Many writers have asked and examined similar questions as we have asked about work. Let us have a look at the conceptions of work, in an attempt to answer some of the many questions that have been asked about work, why we need work and why we work. Conceptions of work. Work occupies a very important position not only in the lives of people but also in society. Work, to most people, is life and life is work. In essence, people work to earn a living, they live in order to work. A renowned philosopher of industrial education, John Akinpelu, 2002, analyzed what he described as the more accepting, humanistic, existentialist philosophy of mankind espoused by Maslow, Roger, and Frere, and concluded that man sees work as an instrument for his own self-realization and self-satisfaction. In discussing the nature of work, some writers conceive work as an institution within which entrepreneurs seek to control economic resources, and in the process, ensure the appropriation of the surplus of their economic ventures. In this regard, work is not organized for survival or to meet social needs of people but for profit. One conclusion that could be drawn from such a conception is that work is a commodity, hardly a vocation. Thus, when the worker is perceived by his employer as not having a commodity to sell for an economic price, he is said to reach the end of his work life and he is compelled to retire. One opinion that stands out is that of Russell, 1983, who conceives work, first as altering the position of matter at, or near the Earth's surface, and second, as telling other people to do so. These two conceptions connote the doing and the telling aspects of work respectively. According to Russell, the doing aspect of work is unpleasant and ill-paid, while the telling aspect is pleasant and highly paid. The conception of work by Russell has implication for work classification as well as for social stratification. In terms of work classification, the telling aspect is essentially the business of management, while the doing is that of labor. Similarly, the tellers are on top of social stratification, while the doers are at the bottom. In a conception similar to the telling and the doing aspects of work, but from a two-perspective approach, The ancient Greeks made a difference between work and leisure. They regarded work as the business of slaves because, by work, they meant physical toil done on command, as a punishment. Study, politics, military service, or even painting one's house was not conceived as work because they were done by choice. From the perspective of the ancient Greeks, therefore, work is conceived as the things people have to do, an interest or leisure activity interpreted as things people like to do. Handy, 1985. Work, as perceived by the ancient Greeks, has a bearing with the advent of wage employment in Nigeria. The idea of working for another person, or for government organizations in energy-sapping ventures, even for payment, was considered degrading because such work was associated with slavery. We learn from history that people were forced against their will to work for payment for the colonial governments in Nigeria, and eventually, a policy of forced labor with pay was formulated. This development became necessary in order to secure sufficient labor needed for railroad construction in 1918. With time, different views about work began to converge to a focus: work provides a means of living. In essence, work is carrying out tasks which enable people to earn a living within the environment in which they live, irrespective of the nature of that work. In pursuance of this concept, many people devote to work the longest segment of the period in which they are awake, and for these people, work is the single pursuit that dominates their lives the most. In another conception, work is a social product, which is best understood within the context of group values and social perceptions of what constitutes worthwhile and meaningful behavior. Social recognition is influenced by the nature of work which one does, as well as the level of success attained in that work. Catherwood, 1997, notes that the right to work is a clause in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed at the United Nations after the Second World War, adding that work was conceptualized as a job or employment. Catherwood notes further that the International Labour Organization, ILO, at that time, estimated that 1 billion new jobs would have to be created between 1984 and the year 2000 to achieve full employment worldwide. Based on the ILO estimate, Catherwood assessed the employment situation in Britain, and asserts, "To me the very clear lesson is that if we were to get 1 million people back to work, let alone the 1.5 million which would bring us back to the more civilized levels of full employment, we will not do it on a vulnerable national currency. We need a European currency backed by a European central bank." Today, in most countries all over the world, there is emphasis on high-level education and manpower development, but full employment, be it conventional or otherwise, with or without common regional currency, has become a mirage. We note that there are millions of people all over the world who make immense contributions to life and living, but whose work does not fit into the classical definition of work. Many of these people are in the informal sector of the economy, others are in unpaid activities. In this circumstance, work has to be redefined to give social recognition and sense of identity to such people. The issue of work continues to receive the attention of governments, educators, and employers of labor. Governments perceive work as a means of achieving economic prosperity. This is why most labor and economic policies and legislation have been dominated by the drive for full employment. The role of education in the business of work. The changing patterns of work and the erosion in the culture of work pose a serious challenge to educators who are not necessarily employers of labor. We note that educators hold different opinions from governments as to the role of education in preparing people for work performance. For instance, Lord Tedder in a Foundation Day address at the University of Ibadan was of the opinion that preparing the adult for work role was not education, since the latter was a process undergone for the acquisition of knowledge, which was of value in itself and not a means by which the possessor was enabled to undertake a further purpose. Lord Tedder believes that the objective of true education is to teach a man how to live, rather than how to earn a living, how to get the most out of life, rather than how to make most money. Could we say that, like education, work is of value in itself? Important as the opinion of Lord Tedder is, we note with sadness and nostalgia, that for many people in the developing world, the overriding interest is how to make the most money out of life rather than get the most meaning out of life through work. Onigu Otaiti, writing on Nigeria, Towards Salvaging a Ravaged Society, observed a trend in the educational system in Nigeria. People want to go to school in the morning and become millionaires in the afternoon of that same day, almost always in politics and in dubious business. I wonder if there is meaning in work for such people. Let us consider two more views about education and work. An important aspect of adult education is self-development, and acquisition of knowledge for the sake of knowledge. This aspect bears heavily on finding meaning in retirement, where continuing education is post-retirement work option. Nonetheless, we note that there is a strong demand for education for employment, so much so that its purpose and procedures could affect all adult education thinking and practice. However, O'Mole, 1999, is more specific in his idea of education for work in the assertion that the principal aim of industrial education and training is the preparation of youths and adults for work life. Sadly though, current statistics indicate that about 50% of youths between 15 and 24 years are unemployed in Nigeria. Certainly, the old age life of these young ones will be different from their parents, more so with changing patterns of work. Changing patterns of work. The changing patterns of work started evolving at the beginning of 1960, and by the end of 1970, society was already beginning to adapt to these changes. Society has been adapting grudgingly but fairly rapidly because the changes are being forced on it by economics, by technology, by the harsh realities of business, and by competition. 3 classifications of work have emerged from the process of adaptation. These are the job work, marginal work, and gift work. Job work is the paid or salaried job working for others in full time. Job work includes full-time self-employment. Marginal work is the work which is done for extra earnings. Gift work includes all the work done for free and involuntary ventures. The threefold perspective of work gives a full picture of work in society, more so as it is pertinent to understand the prevalence of these forms of work. About 3 decades ago, there was a survey study in Britain where 30% of the workforce were part-time employees or self-employed, perhaps from necessity rather than from choice. The survey report, according to Humble, 1982, adds that evidence suggests that the part-timers and the self-employed were the most content with their work. A more recent survey indicates a much higher percentage of the self-employed and the part-timers in the workforce, a trend that is partly attributable, at the beginning, to aging population, and later to global economic crisis. In Nigeria, emphasis is usually placed on paid work as offered by government and the private sector of the economy. But paid work has become difficult to find in recent times. Therefore, as options for survival, part-time work and self-employment are becoming popular, in line with global trends. However, not much is known about gift work, which is outside the framework of survival. The paradox of work. One of the means for survival is money, and work provides money. But there is a paradox about work. Whereas work should improve the well-being of mankind, it ends up as a risk factor for many illnesses. For instance, there are reports in the Awake magazine that more than 2 million people die every year from work-related accidents or diseases. Exposure to dust, chemicals, noise, as well as heart diseases and stroke are some of the work-related hazards and causes of death. There are other work-related hazards. Some medical experts are of the opinion that job dissatisfaction and boredom correlate positively with psychiatric manifestations like somatization, depression, anxiety, and irritation. Work also places great demand on employees' time, leisure, and resources, both physically and psychologically. Ironically, within the various conceptions of work, those who do not have work are seen as parasites or as extras in the play of life. In many societies, work is regarded as a measure of man. In this regard, Handy, quoted earlier, identifies a class of work, defined as a work which allows us to express ourselves, which provides an outlet for our creative energies, our ability to work and relate to others, work which is under our control and not in control of us. Handy adds that there used to be a saying, born a man, died a baker, implying that work provided people with their whole identity and all their money lasted till death. However, the work situation in Nigeria and for many people in the world reflects a reality of born a man, died a pauper, with implication of frontal assault for retirees and the elderly. Some of the issues to contend with are job satisfaction, job security, predictability in employers' behavior, adequate reward for work done, environmental hazards, and regular payment of an adequate pension amount. Work and wealth. In view of the various conceptions of work already presented, the question, why do we work, might be considered unnecessary. However, it is observed that most of the conceptions are from the perspective of the worker, with only a tangential reference to government, education, and industry. Since work and national economy are inextricably linked, it is necessary to examine work as a means of generating national wealth. Some centuries ago, national wealth was seen in terms of gold and silver, MUM, 1986. Therefore, in order to increase national wealth, MUM makes recommendations, some of which are listed herewith. A country must sell more goods and services to other countries than she buys from them. Industries at home must be developed to provide necessities, and unused land must be cultivated. But, the recommendations of MUM would restrict wealth to the balance of payments accounts, while consideration will not be given to all the work that goes on in the service sector of the economy, as in hospitals and in schools. Thus, emphasis will be placed on two sources of wealth: trading wealth, described as the ability to buy and sell in the international market, and activity wealth, described as paid work which is measurable and potentially taxable. Indeed, the emphasis on trading wealth is noted by Godley, Izuriata, and Zeza, 2004, in their report that net exports must now be the imperative for the growth of the economy of the United States of America. The emphasis may have also influenced the rating of Nigeria as one of the poorest nations in the world in 2005. One of the indices used by the World Bank in rating countries is gross domestic product, and in the rating referred to, there was the report that Africa had lost ground in the world export market. The document, Where is the Wealth of Nations? Measuring Capital for the 21st Century, was cited as the source of the rating, which noted that Nigeria is a resource-dependent nation that could have produced capital 5 times higher than it did in the year 2000, if only it had made a moderate effort to save. The World Bank rating could connote a negative perception of the ability of government to meet obligations to employees, as well as to retirees. Involvement in wealth-generating activities may also become less attractive. Public service work. Work opportunities exist in the 3 broad categories of public service, private service, and self-employment. Public service work is conceptualized as government work or civil service work. It is the most problematic area of employment, because many tenets of industrial democracy are either not there or are violated almost always by government. Thus, a review of public service work from the perspective of Udoji's, 1995, Under 3 Masters, Memoirs of an African Administrator, is aimed at enhancing the understanding of the predicament of workers in Nigeria. At independence in 1960, Nigeria inherited the civil service structure and practice of a colonial administration. But after a decade, the scope of government expanded so much that people within and outside government began to express dissatisfaction with the performance of the public service. According to Udoji, academics in particular complained that the inherited public service was still operating the colonial policy of law and order, and was oblivious to the needs of a development-oriented society. Nonetheless, government continued to embark on a series of development programs which required new workers with new skills and orientations. In consequence, both the public service management and staff were given assignments beyond their capabilities. Meanwhile, advances in science and technology had continued to generate and propel new patterns of work. Under these circumstances, public service review became imperative. The Public Service Review Commission of 1972 was, therefore, set up with Jerome Udoji as chairman. According to Udoji, our terms of reference were broader than those of any previous inquiry. They embraced the whole spectrum of public administration with the single exception of the military. Our mandate was, however, limited to questions of how public business should and ought to be conducted. Some of the findings and the consequent recommendations of the Udoji Commission are presented. The quality of public service was severely hampered by cultural, structural, and other management defects. Family, local and ethnic loyalties were implicated. Corruption, as a cultural defect, was widespread. Government did not have an efficient means of detecting corruption. Nigerians tended to treat time and number with disrespect. There were 2 concepts of time. These were Nigerian time and European time. There was multiplicity of classes and grades, resulting in tension between generalist administrators and professional officers. Based on the findings, the Commission recommended what it described as a new style public service. The new style public service was conceived as a service where results are seen in tangible objects, a service that is geared to achieve certain well-defined and articulated goals. It is an irony that many of the findings from the review are as relevant today as they were in 1972. We need to ask a number of questions from the foregoing. Which way is Nigeria tending? Have societal ills such as cultural defects, family, local and ethnic loyalties and corruption become part of our national life? Against the background of contemporary issues in the Nigerian public service, can a claim of a new style public service be made? No, such a claim cannot be made when one considers the experiences of retirees and the elderly people in Nigeria today. A copy of the book Work, Retirement and Graceful Aging by Dr S O Aikhoje can be found on the author's website drsaikhoje.com, at Amazon, and through all other major booksellers.